Hi and welcome to our special event on the war in Ukraine. My name is Dr. Sebastian Kempf. I'm a senior lecturer here at UQ, and I'm very excited to have you here. I'll be chairing the event today. Before we kick things off, I'd like, of course, to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet here today and pay my respect to their ancestors and descendants. Nice to have you all here. Nice to have you on Zoom coming in here. This day marks the 75th day since the Russian invasion started the war in Ukraine, and therefore quite an appropriate, opportune moment to try and to take stock, to look at the major developments and trends that we have observed over the course of the conflict so far, to also try our best to give a bit of an outlook and a prognosis as to what might come. And I'm very pleased that once again we have managed to assemble a stellar lineup here from colleagues both within the School of Political Science and International Studies, but also, of course, from the UQ Law School. So let me quickly introduce everyone here. First person I'd like to point to is Associate Professor Sarah Percy, who's amongst others, her expertise lies at the nexus between international relations as well as international law. She also looks at the regulation of war, the relationship between norms and international law. Right next to Sarah, we've got Dr. Frank Moles, senior lecturer at Pulses, whose expertise lies in political psychology and the ways in which social psychological theories can be used to actually refine political science perspectives on questions of leadership, voter attitudes, with also an emphasis on the European Union. Then we have next to Frank, Dr. Lauren Sanders. This time I got the surname right. Senior lecturer in the School of Law. Lauren's research and teaching interests include international criminal law, international humanitarian law, as well as domestic counterterrorism law. And then finally, last but not least, Andrew Phillips, associate professor here with his amazing hand and arm wave, who is an associate professor in international relations and strategy, focusing in particular on international systems, evolution from around the 1500s all the way to the present, as well as contemporary security challenges. So quite a good lineup, I think, and the format is as follows. Each of them will be given 5 minutes to share their general reflections on the war in Ukraine. Then afterwards, I will ask each of them a very quick question before we then open it up for Q&A with everyone here. Okay? And of course, with everyone here, I mean everyone here physically in the room, but also everyone zooming in with the Q&A. Okay? That's all I wanted to say. Let's kick it off with Sarah.
Okay, I'm the only person using this mic. So I just wanted to ask you, how many people are aware that there are women fighting in this conflict? And how many of you, does anyone have a rough idea of how many women? How many of you were surprised to find out that there were women fighting in this conflict? So that's very interesting, because I bet you if this were 5 years ago, you'd all be quite surprised. But so apparently rough estimates say about between 15 and 17% of the combat troops in this conflict on the Ukrainian side are female. And that's not completely surprising, because actually Ukraine had a very, very high rate of women in combat roles prior to the outbreak of the war. So about 15%. So they've probably only gained an additional 2% of women in as much as anybody is counting. And of course, some of you may be aware that the conscription processes put in by the Ukrainian government explicitly excluded women. So that probably accounts for the fact that there's been fewer women enrolling than we might think. So I think that there are a lot of interesting things that the presence of women in this conflict throw up. One of the things I'm working on at the moment is a history of women in combat. And I think this particular context, both in the nature of the war its geographic location and what women are doing actually tells us quite a little bit about how war has changed and about how our expectations of war have changed, but also about how they haven't changed and how actually we can see there's a surprisingly strong line of historical continuity here about women in combat that this case is a really interesting little nutshell of. So as I mentioned, Ukraine had a very high number of women in its military anyway. But the fact that we've seen women mobilized, and you've seen things like there was famously the pensioner who threw a tin of tomatoes at the drone and knocked it out of the sky, and there's been stories like that as well, that one of the most common exceptions to people's concerns about women in combat is actually related to the defense of your home and your family. So even in periods of time where it's been deemed that women are either incapable or should not ever engage in combat, defending your own house has been okay. And we see this in sieges from the 17th century and 16th century right up through the world wars. So this is quite a common way that we see people. We throw out any niceties we have about whether or not ladies should be fighting if they're actually defending their own families. But there's also a very specifically strong Russian and Ukrainian tradition of women in combat that itself goes back to the 19th century. So there's a very famous woman, Nadezhda Durova, who becomes a cavalry officer in Russia in the 19th century. Russia mobilizes a battalion of women at the very tail end of World War I, actually multiple battalions of women. So the most famous one was called the Battalion of Death, but there's also one that's based in Kiev. So it's a common thing to have Russian women fight. By World War II, it gets extremely common. So there are between 800,000 and 1 million Soviet women under arms in the Red Army. Those include everything from front-line trench troops to tank drivers to the war's most decorated sniper to fighter pilots, bomber pilots, everything. But I think what's particularly interesting about this is even positions which in Western militaries are non-combatant in the Soviet Red Army, people carried guns. So army medics, for example, nurses were trained in the use of firearms, which would not have been the case with the Allies. So there's this very, very strong tradition of women in combat. It's so strong that I think one of our very interesting questions should be, why don't the Russians have any women in combat? Because they fall through very similar cultural and historical traditions. I think there are some interesting reasons for this in the Russian and Ukrainian cases in history, and that probably relates to the slow and almost non-existent development of a middle class prior to the revolution, because women were predominantly not middle-class ladies who were deemed to be incapable and running around in corsets and fainting. They were seen in the fields working, being very physical. So there was perhaps less of a sense that women were physically incapable that developed. But I think that to answer that question of why Russia isn't following suit is especially interesting when we look at the other main area where we've seen women mobilized in combat and see the commonalities with the case in the Ukraine. And that's, we see women very typically in insurgent conflicts or in conflicts where people are fighting for national survival. And this type of more irregular fighting, again, women have gotten involved in it historically. When do we see it? We see it in conflicts of unexpectedly long duration. We see it in conflicts where people are really, really desperate. So if they had any concerns about mobilizing women, they'd chuck them out the window. And we see it because it has a huge propaganda value. So if most people don't expect women to fight, and even your women are fighting, then that shows that actually there's a huge amount of social support for your war. And it's the sort of thing that gets lauded in the international media. And we see this with the women who fight in the various factions of the Kurdish groups in Iraq and Syria, that they get disproportionate amounts of international attention. So it's also a smart propaganda move, which again makes us wonder, why aren't the Russians doing it? I think that part of the answer to that question is the particularly toxic patriarchal nature of the current Russian regime is harking back to a sort of conservatism that is the post-World War II Soviet era, which itself was very dismissive of and deliberately forgot women's contributions. So women weren't allowed to march in the May Day parades that we would have seen just yesterday, the commemoration of. And finally, I just wanted to very briefly touch on the question of sexual violence in combat. One of the first things that people ask me when they find out that I'm writing about women in combat is what happens if women get sexually assaulted in war? And unfortunately, what we are seeing now is that women do frequently get sexually assaulted in war, and women civilians get sexually assaulted in war at a disproportionate rate. And obviously it's a war crime, and obviously it's a particularly heinous war crime. But women in the Soviet army in World War II often pointed out that they would much rather be fighting because they knew that they might get sexually assaulted anyway. So they would rather actually be under arms and fighting than be waiting. And also there's a view that sexual assault is a terribly violent practice in warfare, and it's something that the US military in its repeated discussions about whether or not to mobilize women brought up again and again and again this question. But they seem to be entirely comfortable and aware of the fact that male soldiers get sexually assaulted and have terrible violence perpetrated against them, but that's not sufficient to say that men shouldn't fight. So it's a very interesting gendered understanding of war. And I think that the last thing I want to say about that is that feminist scholarship on war has quite strikingly demonstrated that we tend to see the use of rape in a strategic war crimes way, most often when there is poor unit cohesion amongst the soldiers. So it becomes a particularly horrific way of developing unit cohesion. And that tallies with what we know about the low morale of the units that are being sent to the front in Ukraine and how much people don't want them to be there. So that would seem to uphold that finding, which is a different sort of way of thinking about sexual assault in warfare, but I think perhaps quite a valuable one when you think about how it might be stopped. So that's actually all I wanted to cover. I hope I'm in time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. We're going to smoothly hand over to Andrew Phillips.
Happens to me all the time. I'm not as brave as Sarah, so I need the defensive resource of the desk. 3 points that I'd like to cover. The first is an assessment of Putin's war, how it started versus how it's going. The second is to offer some observations regarding the lackluster performance of the Russian military. And the third is to offer some speculations in terms of where the war might be going. So first, Putin's war, how it started versus how it's going. I keep thinking that there must be an excellent meme that is beyond my technical capabilities to master to convey that. Okay, first, what Putin's goals were. In his February 24th speech, he was explicit in his goals of the Russian special military operation would be aimed at denazification of Ukraine, which was his own way of communicating resolve to overthrow the current government of Ukraine and install a pro-Russian government in its place, and demilitarization of Ukraine. Reduction of its military capabilities and a prevention of any Western military involvement in the conflict. The third unspoken element of his agenda, though, was the partial territorial dismemberment of Ukraine. And that's something we need to be explicit about acknowledging from the outset. 2 days before his February 24 address, he had recognised the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, that is Russophone territories in the east. This was very clearly a prelude towards their absorption into the Russian Federation. So how is it looking 75 days in? Denazification, either scare quotes, denazification. Zelensky's government looks more entrenched than ever now with a very significant level of popular support that was actually far more shaky before the war began. So cross against that in the rubric. Demilitarization. The Ukrainian military has proved to be extraordinarily effective and is now empowered with a significant and continuing infusion of Western military capabilities, including a number of howitzers flown recently from Amberley Air Force Base, not far away from here, to Ukraine itself. Territorial dismemberment. Even Putin's attempt to wind back his goals away from regime change to a more limited eastern offensive has proven thus far to be unsuccessful. So I would have to say, as an academic assessor, he's not even getting a 4 so far. This is a low 3. So why might that be the case? And I think that there are some important lessons here, not only in terms of how the conflict is played out, but what this tells us about war more generally in the contemporary period. The first and most basic level is the imbalance of resolve. Putin, in entering this war, was operating on the assumption that the Ukrainian government would quickly crumble, and his address was explicit in saying, Ukrainian soldiers do not fight for this Nazi junta, stand down and all will be well. In fact, Putin is now learning the lesson that goes all the way back to its first codification under Napoleon, that the moral is to the material 3-to-1. That is, when people are fighting a conflict for their very nation's survival, then they are likely to put up a fairly robust fight. The larger lesson here is that Putin, I think it's fair to say, is guilty of having gotten high on his own supply. This is someone who genuinely does not believe that the Ukrainian state has any legitimacy at all. This is someone who described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. This is someone who's incapable of appreciating the level of Ukrainian nationalism, particularly in the face of a direct assault of this kind. Second, the original operational plan of the Russian military was far too ambitious for what they are capable of accomplishing. This is obvious in hindsight, but given that the Russian military has been plagued with problems of endemic corruption and logistical inadequacies for quite some period of time, the hope to advance simultaneously on 3 fronts in joint operations involving a high level of coordination between air, ground and sea forces, hugely ambitious from the outset, and something that indicated the level of wishful thinking on the part of the Russian military, and probably an unwillingness to communicate to Mr. Putin the lack of reality behind his plans. But most interestingly, what I think comes out of the war to date is a very clear indication of the way in which the Russian way of war is proving inconsistent with the realities on the ground. And let me try to be clear in explaining that. Every military has its own way of conceptualizing how to use armed force in the service of political objectives. And the Russian military historically has 2 ways of doing this. The first is a tradition going back to the Great Patriotic War of using mass and attrition, this very platform-centric, tank-centric way of war, essentially to ground and pound an adversary into submission. And what has become very clearly evident in the way in which the conflict has unfolded is that increasingly this approach to warfare is frustrated by the emergence of cheap and cheerful numerous technologies, for example, drones that have been used extraordinarily effectively by the Ukrainians, in conjunction, it must be said, with Western intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance support, in order to disrupt this capacity to use mass in order to achieve their objectives on the ground. It certainly has not been serendipity, the high level of Russian generals that have been effectively targeted and killed by the Ukrainian military. Certainly not serendipitous for the generals that themselves got killed, but nevertheless. The second element, though, that we really need to keep in mind is when people think of the Russian military, they think of the Russian military of the Cold War and the Great Patriotic War. It's essential for us to keep in mind, though, Russia is one of the great colonial powers of world history. Russia has had a history of expanding onto the Eurasian steppe and into the Caucasus, and central to that way of war has been a strategy of civilian victimization and forced depopulation and displacement of populations to elsewhere. This is something that we have seen again and again in the 2 Chechen wars, in a range of secondary conflicts, for example, Russian involvement in Syria. And what is notable in the contemporary environment is that pursuing that kind of strategy in a context in which the West, admittedly with fairly racial double standards, is now selectively compassionate but genuinely engaged in the conflict, has proven to be not only a propaganda disaster for Russia, but also has actually served to further fortify the resolve of the Ukrainian people. So for a range of reasons, unrealistic political objectives, also a disconnect between the Russian way of war and the realities of the unfolding Ukrainian conflict. This is why we have seen Putin's lack of success to date. Whether he chooses to do something completely funky like escalate to a nuclear level is something that I will leave tantalizingly for you and that I might be able to address in Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. And Lauren, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So I'm trying to keep to my 5 minutes, so I'll only cover 2 points rather than 3 today, which should keep me to about 7 minutes, I think. So 75 days in, I really want to cover 2 aspects. The first being the international law mechanisms on the global stage that we're seeing playing out. And then the second is really focusing in on the international humanitarian law breaches that we've seen and the war crimes that are being reported. So in respect of the first, I think we've seen there's been continuing lawfare playing out in terms of how both Russia and the rest of the world, or those that are aligned with the Ukrainians at least, have been responding to this particular conflict. And what we're seeing is continual Russian interference with multilateralism more broadly. So I'd point to just a really good example being the recent talks in Geneva under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, talking about regulation of lethal autonomous weapon systems. So the Russians were notoriously difficult in participating in this consensus mechanism previously, but this time round, they actually completely derailed the talks so that no formal talks could progress because they claimed they were being disadvantaged by the sanctions that prevented them travelling from airports within Europe to get to Geneva. So realistically, were they so disadvantaged? Not really. They could have just taken a plane from a different port to get there. In the same way, it took Australian representatives 24 hours to get there. So they were still more advantaged than Australia was just by their geography. But one example of how they are still frustrating multilateral actions in terms of international law generally. When we're talking about the other international law mechanisms, we've seen there's been some talk about Russian involvement still as a member of the Security Council and what could be done about that. So there was calls by some people, Ukraine as well, to suggest that Russia should be ejected as a member of the P5 because they are frustrating all of the mechanisms that are built into the United Nations Charter to prevent their ongoing active aggression in Ukraine. Some argument or some debate was made or raised or re-raised about the idea that since the USSR dissolved, because they are the ones who actually were given the seat as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, that now that they are the Russian Federation, they don't technically belong there in the first instance, but we're not going to see any action undertaken by the P5 in that arena because, again, politics more broadly is going to play out. And what we see as far as Russia's seat, they've secured their position because they wrote to the United Nations to say the Russian Federation is the continuing state that represents the USSR that has dissolved. In the same way that China has a stake at ensuring that they are represented in the P5 as a continuing state, noting changes in government seats from Taiwan and Beijing, and also the UK has a stake in being a continuing state, noting some of the changes in its territorial status since the United Nations Security Council was created. So that argument aside, any mechanism that results in voting a permanent member or any member out of the United Nations requires a United Nations Security Council vote, which means Russia is going to frustrate that. So those international law mechanisms are effectively shut off because of Russians' veto. The other thing we're seeing in the lawfare sort of international law spectrum is, again, calls to create new special tribunals to try and hold individuals to account, particularly Putin, when we're talking about the crime of aggression. So the crime of aggression is the act of a leader of a state or a military head of a state trying to acquire another territory by force, which we know is outlawed by the creation of the United Nations Charter, but has also been created as one of the 4 core crimes of international law since the Kampala Conference in recent years. Because Russia is not a member of the ICC, jurisdiction doesn't apply for them to be held to account for any crimes of aggression. Calls to create a special tribunal similar to what we saw in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia would require a United Nations Security Council vote or a majority vote, which is a 2/3 majority if it was referred to the United Nations General Assembly, which of course is a possibility, but because it's a 2/3 majority for substantial votes, but unlikely to see that in any time soon. So circling then across to those sort of accountability mechanisms and zooming in then a little bit more to the breaches of the international humanitarian law by soldiers on the ground. everyone in this room will be aware of the horrific reports coming out of Bucha, coming out of the targeting of individual civilian facilities, as well as the use of rape as a weapon of war, and just individual atrocities being committed on the ground by Russian soldiers. Less reports in terms of breach of the laws of armed conflict by the Ukrainian side. Many explanations for that, though noting that the training, the relative training or understanding of the laws of armed conflict on both sides is low, given the civilian Ukrainians who have joined the armed forces haven't had that opportunity to be so trained in those rules. But there aren't any Russian civilians in the Ukraine to cause significant problems in terms of breaches of the laws of armed conflict. Whereas what we're seeing is, because of that lack of discipline, because of a largely conscripted group on the ground, a large number of atrocities are being committed. Now, those atrocities are really limited to the 3 of the 4 core crimes. We aren't seeing a crime of genocide in Russia. There has been talk about that. Obviously, Putin in the first instance claimed that there was genocide being committed by Ukraine against Russians in the Luhansk and the Donetsk region, but that was dismissed by the International Court of Justice. Whereas on the other side of the house, there's also been claims that there has been genocide committed because of the atrocities that are occurring against the Ukrainians. The distinction being that there isn't an intent to destroy the Ukrainian group as an ethnic group. This is more war crimes that are being committed during the conduct of the hostilities in Ukraine. So a large number of those offences are being committed. Issues with accountability and evidence are quite significant, but I'll leave that one for you to think about. We can perhaps talk about that aspect in questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And Frank, your turn.
Right, thank you all for being here in such great numbers, and thank you for having me. So I wanted to talk today about the oft-heard claim as though the conflict is the West's fault, or NATO's fault, or the European Union's fault. And because I'm not an expert in the West or in NATO, but have studied the European Union quite a bit in the last decade or so, I wanted to hone in on the question of whether the EU is to blame. That might seem a weird proposition to begin with, but it's not uncommon to hear commentators on TV making this kind of hand-wavy movements. Just a couple of days ago, I was watching Deutsche Welle, and there was George Bieber from the Wilson Center in the United States claiming that the European Union was to blame and had provoked the conflict. I was kind of baffled by that statement, not least because there's no evidence presented whatsoever or a logic. So what is the EU to blame? You might be forgiven for thinking that if you look at some evidence suggesting that the European Union might have made things worse. Think of Ursula von der Leyen, the current Commission president, making some comments around Slava Ukraina, right? Which means victory to Ukraine, which is not a helpful comment, I think. But think also about the application forms that have been signed 4 days after Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine invades on the 24th of February. On the 28th, the application process is started officially. Of course, that can be seen as steps that aggravate the situation. I understand that. At the same time, I think there's so much more to see that doesn't get a look in. And what I wanted to do today is just unpack that a bit further and see what actual evidence is there to suggest that either the European Union is to blame or not. Now, the answer is not going to be easy. As always, it's reaction, action, reaction, but it's also Gestalt psychology, as those of you studying peace and conflict studies will probably know, that any conflict with action, reaction, it's what you perceive the other party to do. So the Gestalt psychologists in the 1960s were arguing that a defensive move will be perceived as an offensive action, and therefore you get this cycle of violence. So there is no easy answer here, and I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer to the question whether the EU is to blame. What I want to do instead is unpack things and shed a bit of light on things that we tend to overlook. First of all, at a very basic level, the European Union does not hire a legion of sales reps who go around capital cities outside the European Union with brochures saying, please do become a member. That view seems to be around a bit, as if the European Union is an expansionist entity that wants to have more and more members. Of course, there's long-standing debate amongst the existing EU member states whether
the preferred future of the European Union is one of widening or deepening. The United Kingdom traditionally was more of an advocate of widening so that it would stop deepening, and France and Germany, the two main players in the continent, were typically more advocates of deepening and therefore less reluctant to widen. That was, for example, the reason why Turkey's accession had been a bit of a hot potato item, because the United Kingdom typically was more pro-enlargement than France and Germany. So there's that dynamic, that the European Union member states are not aligned in terms of whether Ukraine has to come on board or has to be welcomed on board. There's different views about that. But at the same time, Turkey is a good example to put things a little bit into context. Turkey signed an association agreement with the European Union, in European communities, I should say, because it was still the European communities, in 1963. So that's a long time ago. That has never been seen as inevitably leading to accession of Turkey to the European Union, and neither has that been perceived as a security threat by Russia or any other party in the world, as far as I'm aware. Then in 1995, Turkey signed the customs union agreement. Right? So it becomes even more integrated in the European market with at that point in time, the expectation that it could lead to membership. But of course, now that ship has almost sailed, I think we could safely say that. And I think the Turkish example is a good way to contrast what happens with the EU-Ukraine association agreement, which was signed in 2012 and came into effect in 2017. That was not necessarily seen as a step towards membership. It could be, it could not be. It was an open-ended story. It's only when Russia invades that then the accession process actually starts officially. And now we can retrospectively see it as a stepping stone towards accession. By the way, have you ever read the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement? I haven't, because it's 2,135 pages long. I downloaded it and I did a search for Russia, and the word Russia features in it 3 times, and it's featured in the same way. It's Russian sturgeon. It's mentioned as one of the produce that Ukraine can import or export rather into the European Union without paying import levies. So there's nothing in the EU Association Agreement that necessarily tells us about a relationship negotiation with the EU either. There's lots more things to see. I don't know how I'm going for time, but yeah, okay. There's much more to see. For example, also the Dutch-Ukraine referendum that took place that signals how difficult the EU-Ukraine relationship is, that it's not an unequivocal alignment in terms of welcoming on board. But I'll leave it at that because I think I'm running out of time. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you to the 4 of you for the opening statements. As I had threatened at the beginning, I will ask a question, very quick question to each of the panelists here, and then we open it up for Q&A with you all. If you're on Zoom, you can already post your question there. I saw that some of people have done that already, so we'll obviously then come to that. I want to actually contradict myself right away, because Lauren is the first one I'm going to ask 2 quick questions towards, because you mentioned already Bucha and atrocities during war. We are very often in war, and this war is no exception, very quick to actually claim that there is a war crime or an atrocity happening. It's much harder to find evidence for that. So how do lawyers actually go about investigating this and trying to gather evidence? That's the first one. And the second one is about what is the threshold, legally speaking, at which point countries that we see as NATO members, EU members, who are now supplying all sorts of hardware, military training, what's the threshold of that kind of support turning in from passive to active participants in war?
2 small questions to cover in a short period of time. So in respect of war crimes, the prosecution or the brief for these kinds of crimes are very similar to normal criminal offence prosecutions, except that there is the additional challenge of trying to collect evidence in a war zone. So the ability to collect information and evidence in an armed conflict is exponentially more difficult, because in most cases, the information about who has committed the offences is held by one side of the conflict and usually held in secrecy. And those individuals, of course, aren't typically in the jurisdiction where the offences have occurred. So the ability to actually investigate and identify the people who have committed these offences is extraordinarily difficult. So typically it relies, or the investigation of war crimes relies on the cooperation of the state party to whom the offenders belong, which is going to be difficult in this context where the cooperation of Russia is already flagged to be difficult because they are denying most of these offences in the first instance. They do have some history of internal disciplinary systems where they do hold their individual soldiers to account. So you can Google some of the murder trials that have occurred for the Chechen conflict recently, but discipline within the Russian forces is difficult, but access to the soldiers is probably one of the greatest challenges, and access to evidence that isn't going to be destroyed in the middle of an armed conflict is another one. So this conflict is slightly different, and we've got some additional benefits because of the access and the continuing access of communication systems, which we haven't seen in a lot of conflicts previously. Because of the breadth of records that we have, there is a better or an easier access to information. We are hearing in some cases of the use of AI for facial recognition technology. That's still not really very well tested to be relied upon for evidential briefs, and then you still have the access to the individual's problem. But we're also seeing that there's contemporary investigations occurring, which is really crucial to the ability to preserve and record evidence. So the OSCE has conducted a brief investigation into war crimes. We've got the ICC conducting their investigation as we speak, as is the Ukrainian prosecutors. So the Ukrainian government has been bolstered. Australia has sent a number of investigators to assist them. So they're able to actually conduct these investigations as the offences are occurring, which is really, really going to assist in the ability to properly record and document what's occurred for the possibility of future prosecutions. But again, many face some of those challenges about access to the individuals. And then there's the whole deepfake issue and the verification of evidence, which is another 20 minutes of answer, so I'll park that one. And as far as the issue of neutrality and co-belligerency is concerned, there's a few different threads there that a lot of people do confuse. The first is, what is the law of neutrality? So since the Hague Conventions, there was the laws and duties of neutrals in relation to land and naval warfare, so Conventions 8 and 5 respectively, and they deal effectively with what another state can do in terms of interacting with an armed conflict before they become party to that armed conflict. So how do you stay neutral? Prior to the United Nations, prior to the League of Nations and then the United Nations Charter, there was a pretty strict everyone stays out of it, and it's only the people in the fight that are parties to the conflict. But since then, there's a couple of different academic views about what this is, what the current laws of neutrality look like. But since then, there's been a development to say, well, actually, no, we have declared that there is always if there's an aggressor in a conflict, that party is on the wrong side, in which case everyone can assist the aggrieved party. So in this case, the aggressor in the conflict is Russia. That's been pretty clearly articulated by the United Nations General Assembly, the ICJ. That's not really a contentious issue. So those countries that are aiding through the provision of military assistance to the Ukraine are not actually making themselves or breaching the laws of neutrality, but they are actually just exercising a right of qualified neutrality because they're assisting the aggrieved state. So that's one thing where we're talking about the laws of neutrality, where breaching that is going to result in reparations or countermeasures available from an international law perspective. The other issue is whether or not a state is taking part in the conflict. So there's a separate body of law that talks about whether we are actually party to a conflict, and so if we are co-belligerent or not. And effectively what we're talking about, particularly with an international armed conflict, the threshold is a lot clearer. We're talking about those combat type actions. So provision of information, intelligence information is getting really close to the line. Training and arming of forces is not as problematic, provision of material assistance is not problematic, but if you're actually conducting belligerent acts, then your state would become a party to that international armed conflict. So as it stands, there doesn't appear to have been any other countries that have taken part in the conflict. It hasn't become further internationalized. There are some questions, and Putin's starting to claim that if the US is doing more in terms of provision of intelligence, that they might soon become a party or a belligerent party to the conflict, which would then, of course, bring them into the fight. So I'll leave it at that.
Right, thank you. And sorry to throw two questions right at you. Everyone else gets just one. So I'll continue with Frank here. And just as our token EU expert, I just would like to, focus perhaps on two countries where we see really interesting developments as a consequence of that. And that would be, of course, Sweden and Finland, who are now openly seeking NATO membership. So I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that and maybe also on some broader developments we've been seeing in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
microphone.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's of course massive, right? These developments are quite stunning and stellar. I think another interesting story is, of course, Germany. After so many decades of restraint in military capacity, then suddenly deciding it's a time now for change, and to abandon that policy altogether and making huge commitments in military spending, which is a massive turnaround within the European Union in a member state. I think the other more broader question is, of course, that Putin suddenly has made Europe great again, right? So suddenly we see a unity that we haven't seen before, both in terms of the leadership of member state governments, as well as, I think, popular sentiment. I think the whole idea of all the Euroscepticism that we've seen was already dwindling because of Brexit. I think Brexit was showing that maybe it's a good idea to stick together in this day and age of uncertainty. But I think certainly the Russia-Ukraine conflict has cemented that idea that perhaps we live in a dangerous world where liberal institutions have a place, right? So I think these are probably the two biggies for me.
Okay, great. Thank you, Frank. Next one goes to Sarah, and I'd like to start off with the famous idiom that, of course, the truth as the first casualty in war, which of course makes, for any of us here at university and academia, makes it actually very hard to siphon through the plethora of information where it's very hard to get a sense, is that now verified, is that correct, is that kind of deep fakes and so on. And so perhaps as a general question that would be not just applying to you, but I think is relevant to all of us. Sarah, how do you go about filtering out what is reliable? How do you picture together from the news that you're watching an assessment of what's happening on the ground?
Well, that's an easy question, Seb. So I think that this is a really interesting problem, and it's particularly acute. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is the degree to which we are getting personal reports from individuals who are on the ground in Ukraine. And that's happened in other wars since the dawn of the internet age as well. But I think the difference here is a lot of those communications are in English. So they're really easily accessible to a wide audience of people like us who are English speakers. So one of the challenges is, how do you contend with that? If any of you are on Twitter, with that veritable fire hose of information of people who are coming out of the ground on Ukraine. Of course, not all of it is true. And what do you do to assess? And I think that for me, I take everything with a grain of salt, and you look for it to be confirmed in multiple sources. But I think one of the challenges that we've got is the fact that we live in a world where we know deepfakes are possible, and the fact that Russia has managed to an astonishing degree, persuade its citizens that all sorts of things are happening in Ukraine, which are not in fact happening. So the question of truth in this particular conflict is very, very slippery. Then again, in my theme of very little is new under the sun, obviously, as you say, fake news is a feature of warfare, and entirely concocted stories have been common, for centuries. But our ability to discern that becomes harder and harder as it becomes more and more important to sort out the truth. So I suppose just be an educated consumer, try and find multiple sources for what you're looking at, and take it all with a grain of salt.
Great, thank you. And then the microphone can go over to Andrew, and then final question to him, and then we'll hand over to your questions and points, obviously. Andrew, we've heard Putin repeatedly threaten to go nuclear. And that's a big worry, not just people here in the room, but like friends, relatives that I talk to in Europe in particular. How likely do you think, how seriously do we take the Putin's threat to go nuclear?
I think it's worthwhile distinguishing two types of threat. So there is the diffuse threat to escalate to what's euphemistically known as a general nuclear exchange, otherwise known as the end of the world, where if the conflict spins out of control, that leads to an escalation of the West and Russia attacking each other's cities. And I would say that the chances of that are extraordinarily remote. And I say that for two reasons. The first is that was very dramatic, thank you. If I'm wrong, none of you will be in a position to hold me into account. But somewhat less glibly, there is no sign of a change in the strategic readiness of Russia's nuclear forces. And this is something to keep in mind, that the Soviet Union has had a nuclear capability since 1949. The West is very good at watching what Russia's body language is respect with strategic nuclear weapons. There's been no indication, the rhetoric notwithstanding, that there has been a meaningful change in posture. So I don't necessarily worry about the end of the world, but I'm an academic, so I do like to worry. There is a distinction between strategic nuclear weapons, there you're talking about your city-killing type weapons, and tactical nuclear weapons. So give you an indication, tactical nuclear weapons anywhere from 1 kiloton to 100 kilotons. Context, the Hiroshima bomb was about 15 kilotons. So a 1 kiloton bomb is at the smallest end of the spectrum. It's still going to ruin your day. The concern that I have, and that I think actually is a legitimate one, the Russians think about nuclear weapons in a different way to the West. In particular, there has been talk in Russian nuclear doctrine for the past 15 years of what is ominously but euphemistically referred to as a strategy of escalate to de-escalate. And the intuition behind that is to suggest that in a conflict that is spiraling out of control, there might be a justification for Russia to use a tactical nuclear weapon in order to essentially send a signal to the world of, hey, this is getting serious, we're deploying our nuclear capabilities, we can escalate far higher levels of destruction, but we're going to use this as a circuit breaker, so to speak. I think there is a possibility of Putin pursuing that as an option. If we explore that thread a little further, there's two different ways that he could pursue this strategy. And neither of them make sense to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he wouldn't do it. Nuclear strategists, they love their jargon. So there's a distinction between counter value and counter force strikes. A counter value strike is, to simplify, targeting civilian centres of population. So there's a possibility that Putin might use a tactical nuclear weapon against an Ukrainian city. I think that's unlikely because as even someone as blissfully dismissive of international opinion as Putin would face serious consequences of attacking a city for the first time since August 1945. Second possibility would be a counter-force strategy of saying, well, we'll target a concentration of Ukrainian armour, for example, and use that as a signal flare that things are getting serious. I think even that is unlikely. It would be breaching what people call the nuclear taboo, which is that a nuclear weapon has not been used in anger since 1945. It would take the conflict into uncharted territory, and it could potentially also lose Putin some diplomatic support he's enjoyed thus far, for example. To give simply one example of this, China is very robust in its commitment to the principle of no first use. If Putin was to escalate to de-escalate, he might potentially do so at the expense of losing one of the few important diplomatic supporters of him.
Great, thank you. So I would now like to open it up to your questions and comments. If you are here in the room, please raise your hand. We've got two wonderful assistants here. We've got, on the one hand, Chloe, who's going to come around. We've got Liam as well. They're going to come to you. If you are on Zoom, please, as some of you have already done, type it into the Q&A, and I'll try to mix between in-room and on Zoom questions here. And maybe just quickly as a reminder to everyone, this is not a political platform, but an academic forum where we try to decipher what's going on. And so we also want to treat each other in this sort of hot-tempered topic in a respectful manner. And finally, please try to keep it succinct so we can actually get as many questions in as possible. So is there anyone here in the room who would start? So why don't we go with the lady over there? You stay here. And maybe also if you could say if the question is directed at someone specific, yeah. And then if you can sort of show me your hands again, I can have a bit of a look as well.
This one's just more of a general one. I wanted to know if what, if any, role does R2P have in the conflict at this stage?
Does anyone of you want to? Oh, can you sort of speak up a bit? Sorry.
What, if any, role does R2P have in the conflict at this stage?
I'm quite happy to start with that. And I think the answer is none, because there has been a very clear demonstration that deployment of forces to respond to protect the Ukrainian population is likely to escalate. And as a consequence, we have seen significant shying away from any actions that could be considered escalatory from any other state. And the internal obligation to respect international humanitarian law is also something that's been problematic in terms of this conflict.
Okay, nice quick answer. We go to the next one. We go to the next one here. And then Liam, we got someone else.
My question is for Andrew. You were talking in the beginning about Putin's 24th of February speech, and I just wanted to know, yesterday during Victory Day, he made another speech as well, and I just wanted to know if there was any differences in what he was saying and what that sort of means for the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, that is a terrific question. And it makes me extraordinarily relieved that I did actually read the speech yesterday, so I can answer it with some credibility. What I took out of the speech was that it was surprisingly less belligerent than I'd anticipated. So you had the standard Victory Day boilerplate of the Great Patriotic War. And it's worthwhile us remembering that the Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the conflict in the Second World War. It's become absolutely integral to Russian national identity. So there were a large number of references that resonated there. What I thought was interesting about it is that the speech first acknowledged the Russian casualties that have occurred so far in the conflict. There are estimates that 15,000 Russian troops have lost their lives. If that is the case, that's as many as they lost in a decade of involvement in Afghanistan from 79 to 88. The fact that Putin's acknowledged that is an indication that he's aware that the level of blood sacrifice in the conflict can no longer be concealed. The other elements, though, that were interesting is that he invoked the idea of we're fighting on behalf of the people of Donbass. He referenced violence from 2014 onwards that is not particularly acknowledged in the Western world, but that he would know would resonate for Russian speakers. What I found interesting, though, is that there were a large number of expectations beforehand that he would really ramp up the rhetoric, that this would be a rhetorical escalation to a commitment to total war. And what we haven't seen is that kind of rhetorical doubling down. So I think what is interesting about the speech is that he signalled to the Russian people this is likely to be a longer fight. He has invoked, I think, quite mischievously and historically inaccurately, analogies between the Ukrainians now and the Nazis in World War II in order to give a bit of rhetorical oomph to what it is that he's doing. But what I also found interesting is that the contrast with the speech in February 24 is quite instructive, in that speech was very much one that communicated maximalist objectives. We'll denazify Ukraine, i.e. change the government, we'll demilitarize that, increasingly, if you look at the few political objectives that he mentioned in the speech yesterday, it was, well, Crimea is not going anywhere and we will help protect the people in Donbass. So I thought it was an interesting speech in as much as what it didn't say, which was that commitment to total war, is what it did. Great question, mate. Thank you.
Okay, I'll bring in a question from Zoom. Conveniently from an anonymous attendee as the name, but it's a good question here. It's like, to what extent do you think international sanctions can influence Putin's decisions when actors like China so far are not applying the same economic consequences? Sarah, do you want to?
So I think that the non-compliance of China in this regard, obviously the more effective a sanctions regime, the more universal a sanctions regime is, the more effective the impact of those sanctions. That said, I think that the sanctions, they have been devised in relation to this situation, have been devised knowing that China was not going to participate. So they've actually been quite cleverly designed to put maximum pressure on Putin, even if China isn't participating. And particularly we see those in the realm of financial sanctions. But I wonder, that bankrupting a middle class has historically not been actually a terribly useful way to achieve change. In some cases, it can make people angrier and more supportive of the government. So I think in the long run, we've got this funny tension where clearly it is beginning to put pressure on Putin. And that's obviously the goal of these sanctions, is to try and create some sort of internal movement in Russia, which a lot of people think is maybe the only thing that's going to end the conflict quickly. But whether or not the Russian publicity and propaganda machine is able to direct some of that anger outward rather than inward, I think that's the risk that they're taking. But I think the China question is perhaps, because of the design of the sanctions, less relevant than it might be otherwise. But I don't know whether or not anybody else wants to jump in on that one. Yep.
Also, don't forget that oil exports to Europe have continued, right? Since the 24th of February, this statistic comes from last week, so it's probably changed, but $44 billion of oil has been exported to European Union countries, and I think it's in the 60 billion for the whole of Europe. Of course, this pledges to wean ourselves off the oil, and it has actually brought forward plans for renewable energy transportation throughout Europe. So there's some side effects on renewable plants. But I think there's a lot more intertwining and interdependence that we acknowledge, and not just in oil and gas. There's lots of intricacies that I was going to talk about had I had more time. But think of, for example, in the Netherlands, my home country, there's gas processing facilities that are owned part by the Dutch government, and it's leased to Kremlin businesses. So they've got these contractual obligations that they can't walk away from immediately. Think of the tax evasion systems in this world, where that's Ibrahimovic who suddenly sells off Chelsea, and then 2 days later is in Amsterdam South, a place notorious for law firms who help Russian oligarchs hide their wealth. So there's a lot more to be seen at the level of political economy and interdependence between the Russian economic sphere and the European sphere, I think. And that's easily forgotten in a time of war, where the units of analysis become Russia versus Ukraine versus Europe versus America, China, and so forth.
Okay, great. I've got next question over here, and if you could signal to me again in the room, that'd be great.
My question's for Andrew and for Sarah. How do you view military progress versus international reputation as being a deciding factor for Putin in terms of military escalation?
Yeah, I think that Putin is relatively dismissive of international reputation as we understand it. One of the few consistencies in the speeches of the February 24th and his Victory Day speech was the idea that Russia and the West are locked in the form of some form of existential struggle. He's very specific about saying, and a lot of this is actually boilerplate rhetoric going back to the early 2000s of the push for a more multipolar world. The latest spin on that is, which I find ironic given the cross-pollination that's occurring between Russia and elements of the far right in the West, But the latest thing that's cropping up in some of Putin's speeches is the idea of, well, the West is trying to cancel 1,000 years of traditional culture, which I think is another interesting ideological wrinkle in the process. My sense is that Putin is not sensitive to diplomatic opprobrium from the West. He is moderately sensitive in the medium term to economic consequences, although I think, as Sarah has noted, I mean, he would recognise that broad-based sanctions can have a tonic effect for beleaguered dictators in terms of their level of popular support. So for me, the sense is that Putin looks at this very much through the lens of the military progress they can achieve either now or later. And I think that we need to be very mindful of that second element. If we look at the way in which the Russian military progress has panned out, they're not on plan B at the moment. They're pushing towards plan D. Plan A was a coup de main on February 24th that would replicate the success in the Crimea in 2014. Didn't happen because they fundamentally misread the larger political picture. Plan B, ground and pound, multi-pronged blitzkrieg attack, again, didn't work. Plan C, revert back to a more modest offensive to seize control of the entirety of the Donbass. That hasn't been successful either. The concern that I have in terms of Putin's calculations is that Plan D could be a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts. They're saying, okay, well, I can get a negotiated settlement that makes all of Ukraine essentially a frozen conflict, and then I can revert back to multi-domain strategies of subversion, assassination. It wouldn't be the first time, by the way, that Russia has sought to assassinate or permanently maim the leader of Ukraine, with a view towards chipping away incrementally at Ukraine's sovereignty in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's my take in terms of, I think, how it looks at the world.
When Andrew was talking about what keeps him up worrying at night, what keeps me up worrying at night is the absence of an obvious end game. Because I completely agree with Andrew. I don't think Putin cares about international public opinion. He cares a little bit about what some of his closer allies, what China says, but otherwise doesn't care at all. So the question is, what does the end game look like? And it's very, very hard to see what it is, because a total pullout is plainly not going to happen. That would be even for Putin, probably domestic political suicide. So what are the alternatives? Well, none of them are particularly great. So my variation to Andrew's is just war of attrition. So there's no pulling out, but Putin's willingness to stay in it is probably pretty high. And he'll just have to constantly weigh that domestic cost. But at the moment, he's been able to carry it to an astonishing degree. And I mean, to throw another equation to the mix, I agree with Andrew's analysis of nuclear weapons completely. I'm less sanguine about the prospects for the use of chemical weapons, where I think he'd be willing to have a punt. I think all of the reasons why he wouldn't be willing to have a punt on nuclear, you've expressed admirably, but I wonder whether or not that's another way to force a change in the status quo that I certainly hope wouldn't eventuate. So that's a very rosy and cheerful answer to your question.
Hi, Lauren, I have a question for you.
And can you hold the microphone a bit closer?
Sorry. A question for Lauren. So something that you mentioned earlier was the concept of neutrality and the idea of qualified neutrality, where you can aid a victim. I'm curious about states like Belarus who are aiding an aggressor. Do the laws of neutrality cover that? Is that a breach of international law, whether by the Hague regulations or custom? Like, can you speak on that a little bit, please?
Sure. So I think there's two parts to the Belarusian participation in the conflict. And one is that they're actually probably past the line of actually being, well, one, they're not neutral, but two, they're actually past the line of not being participants in the conflict from the Russian side of the house, because they are actually allowing attacks to be launched from their territory. So that would be sufficient to make them co-belligerents, which means they are technically part of that conflict. So that means it would be lawful for Ukrainian forces to launch attacks against Belarusian forces into their territory, because they're now part of that international armed conflict. And if anyone else joined the conflict, then Belarus would be a belligerent party to that particular international armed conflict. From the neutrality side of the house, equally, they are no longer neutral. From an international law perspective, what that means is that Ukraine has rights from for reparations and countermeasures against Belarus. So reparations, again, unlikely to occur in the near term, but more likely a longer term activity. And in the same way, I was probably quickly dismissive of the RTP question before. I think what we are seeing here is a lot of these strict legal issues are really giving way to the geopolitical issues that are at play. So the ability for the Ukraine to do anything in respect of Belarus is limited because of that geopolitical situation that we're seeing, and likewise with the R2P piece. So sorry if I was too quick in just cutting that position off, but unfortunately that's what we're seeing with a lot of the technical legal issues around this particular conflict.
Okay, so I'll take two questions that we've had in the Zoom chat before we come back to the room here. The first one is directed to Sarah from Cormac. Do you think, Sarah, the role of private military/security companies will grow as the conflict drags on? And that's to Sarah. And I've got one to Andrew from our colleague Matthew Sussex, who asks you specifically, question for Andrew. There has been much discussion about Ukraine winning the war, but what does victory look like for Ukraine and how realistic is that prospect? So we go Sarah first, Andrew second, come back to the room here.
Thanks, Cormac. If I'd had more time, private military and security companies were something else I was going to cover in my talk. So I think that the use of private military and security companies on the Ukrainian side remains unlikely because their propaganda narrative is so much about Ukrainian self-defense and they're getting pretty broad assistance. So I think in terms of Ukraine hiring a private military and security company, unlikely. The presence of private military and security company personnel who are there on the quiet assisting Ukraine, I don't know, probably I think that might be a reasonably likely scenario, but I don't think we'll see a large scale. The Russian side's super interesting though, because Russia has a fairly well-developed capacity in the private military and security sphere. The main company is the Wagner Group. That group is unlike any Western private military and security company because everyone knows it's a covert arm of the Russian state with a very, very, very thin fig leaf of plausible deniability to what they're doing. So yes, Putin has that capacity. It's had demonstrated capacity in places in Africa and particularly in Syria. It's very effective. They're pretty professional. Perhaps more loyal even, given the pay structure, which is ironic when we're talking about mercenaries to some people, but probably a very useful tool for Putin to use, but not a private company in the sense that we recognize companies that are operating in the West, because there's no distinction really between that and any other covert arm of the Russian state.
Thanks, Sarah. Andrew, to you.
Thank you, Matthew, on Zoom for giving me a very good and extremely difficult question to answer. So what would victory for Ukraine look like? Look, my view is that we need to contextualise by acknowledging that this is a war that didn't begin on February 24th, 2022. This is a war that's being waged against Ukraine pretty much for most of the period in which Putin has been in office, but particularly from 2014 onwards, when part of the territory was torn off Ukraine in the form of Crimea, and the conflict in the Donbass region really kicked off in earnest. So I believe the secret to happiness in life is to have low expectations. What might that look like in terms of the context for Ukraine? My view would be a realistic victory scenario for Ukraine if they are capable of continuing to hold on and the costs of economic isolation continue to mount for Putin such that there is a momentary lapse of his resolve. The best I suspect that Ukraine could hope for, my view is Crimea is gone. Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014, and Putin explicitly singled out Crimea in the Victory Day speech yesterday. The hope for Ukraine would be a cessation of further territorial dismemberment and a scenario post-conflict in which, my cute line on this is that Ukraine becomes the Switzerland of Eastern Europe. So that would be a situation in which it is nominally neutral, and Zelensky has actually put foregoing NATO membership on the table, but that it is in practice armed to the teeth and enjoys significant and ongoing Western military support. The real question, though, is first, obviously, the degree to which Putin can be forced to swallow what would be an extraordinarily bitter pill. But the second one would be, who's going to pay for this? This has been an extraordinarily expensive war for Ukraine. By the measures that I've seen, the Ukrainian economy has already shrunk 45% from the start of the year. Every day, billions and billions of dollars of more damage are being done to Ukraine. And this is part of Putin's strategy. Putin's strategy is now reverting to a strategy of exhaustion. If he can inflict enough pain on the populace, if he can pulverize enough of the country's infrastructure, that eventually, out of desperation, Zelensky will give up. For me, the $1 trillion question is people are talking now about a post-war Marshall Plan for Ukraine. The question would be, who is going to pay for that? The United States, which is currently politically divided and facing its own very significant domestic economic problems. The European Union, I would defer to Frank on that. My concern is even a victory is potentially likely to be a relatively Pyrrhic one. So sorry I can't be more optimistic, Matthew, but there you go.
Yeah, thank you. We go to Shofi up there next, and then we've got the next question, Liam, conveniently down here. You can bring the microphone to your partner.
My question is for Lauren. When a war occurs, we tend to talk more about humanitarian, about violating international humanitarian law, but under UN Charter, the use of force itself is prohibited. My question is, can Russia in this case or a country in general be prosecuted for violating use ad bellum?
Thanks. So the crime of aggression is effectively how that could be directed to prosecute an individual. Separately, when a country has breached the norms under the United Nations Charter to try to acquire territory by force, the response is sanctions or countermeasures or reparations or declarations by the United Nations Security Council and the UN General Assembly as to what to do. So realistically, accountability is focused on individuals. Holding individuals to account is how international criminal law is structured to try and respond to these issues. And as it stands, there is very low support for the crime of aggression as an actual offence, whilst it's one of the 4 core crimes and it's a crime under the Rome Statute. Many states are yet to domestically ratify that, to actually ratify the Kampala agreements. Australia, for example, has not yet ratified the Kampala agreements and has not made the crime of aggression a domestic offence in our criminal code, which is how we would prosecute a person if they had actually committed that offence. So I think there's more political concerns about how to deal with that issue, because many states are still concerned about taking that or making that a criminal offence for what it might potentially do to expose some of their own individuals to prosecutions by either their own states or other states that might be seeking to use universal jurisdiction, for example, as a vehicle to try and to prosecute them for either political reasons or because they have actually breached that that international law prohibition previously.
I just wanted to ask maybe Lauren, in regards to the humanitarian corridors and Russia's violations of those corridors, do you think that that is, part strategy to kind of break down the morale of the Ukrainian side, or is that more maybe just on-ground provocation?
That's more of a military strategy question, but from a law perspective, there isn't really a legal, there isn't a legal rule per se that talks about humanitarian corridors, other than the fact that they're used as a measure to facilitate civilians departing conflict, to protect civilians. The crime is actually in the targeting of the civilians if they are using those corridors. What we're seeing from a political and strategic perspective, and I know I'm straying outside my area now, which is I'm happy to do, is that what we've also seen is Russia is using those humanitarian corridors for strategic and political gains by saying we've had these humanitarian corridors in effect, we haven't been targeting civilians, but of course all the corridors lead to Russian territory, which is problematic. Ukrainian civilians are not going to get up and leave their hometown when they're trying to defend themselves and defend their territory and move into Russian territory as their safe haven. So they are being held up as a humanitarian action. They are being held up as a demonstration of compliance with international humanitarian law by Russia, but they are not actually in practice meaningful, I think. But I don't know if anyone else wanted to comment more from the strategy side.
I think there's, let's do like one more quick round of maybe 2-3 questions that might still be in the room. We're going to have one here. Is there anyone else in the room? Oh yeah, and then we've got one here. So let's take anyone else? Got 2, and then we've got Chloe next to you. We go 1, 2, 3. We take them together, right?
Hi, my name's Tana, and probably this question is directed towards Lauren. And I'm awful at public speaking, so I'm just going to read my question. You said that international law mechanisms haven't worked because of Russia's P5 membership in the United Nations Security Council and their access to a veto vote. So do you think that ramifications of the war and like the future effects and like more so like UN theory, I guess, is like, okay, wait, do you think ramifications of this war will be international society's questioning of the P5 and whether they are still a current reflection of today's international system?
I think that's a great question. And I think that's been the response of the international community since this has occurred, to say we've built this system around having a balancing mechanism where we have 5 people with veto, or 5 states with vetoes in relation to how we've established this system. We've got the rotating membership of everybody else. But there are notionally enough balancing mechanisms like sanctions, like the possibility if the international community has the will to do so, to intervene lawfully under principles like responsibility to protect, under grounds of collective self-defense. So there exists the mechanisms under the Charter to respond. There exists the mechanisms to address this conflict in terms of those reparations, countermeasures, sanctions, and those levers all exist. The question is just whether they're sufficient to overcome some of those other political, geopolitical, nuclear strategy questions. And I think that's the issue we're seeing, which is that freezing of response because of those other pragmatic political concerns by the international community. So and sort of the posturing of other P5 members in response to that is another issue that everyone's also talking about. What does this mean then for the future of other states if they think that they could act with impunity? Which is why we're seeing discussion about trying to come up with some creative or alternative measures to influence how we could hold Russia to account, which is that instance of the special tribunal that I mentioned before. There are some mechanisms where the United Nations General Assembly could vote using a majority vote, which is 2/3 for substantial resolutions, to try and create some additional or different mechanisms to address the problem. But I don't think the system is fundamentally broken. I think that this is just a reflection of the inherent complexity of the international order, international law, and international politics.
Okay, so we'll take those 2 questions together, starting Chloe next to you, and then Liam.
Sorry, this is more of a general question, but what will the next month or so of the conflict look like? Like, what is your, I guess, prediction, perhaps?
This is a wonderful question. We will have actually a final round going through here. We're going to ask everyone to kind of give a bit of an outlook. So maybe it'll be answered and you get an answer from all 4. So that's the wonderful question you get here. So we got a final question here.
I just wanted to ask the panel's opinion on sort of the United States' involvement in the conflict and whether or not the perceived instability of the United States in the wake of certain elections was what sort of drove Putin to sort of seize the opportunity, and whether or not the changing political climate in the United States will have further impacts on the Ukraine crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, nice one. Frank, you were nodding. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I can maybe start answering that. I think that's a really good question because that's crossed my mind as well. Why now, right? I mean, you can talk about Putin's career. He's getting all this is his moment. If it's now, not now, when then? But I think the timing also seems to me to do with public opinion elsewhere. The fact that far-right movements were on their height in many Western European countries, The US is falling over itself internally with polarization being quite high. I can only speculate. There's no certainty here, but that's crossed my mind as well. And I think at the time, if you look at most Western European far-right parties have had some cozying up from the Kremlin, either through funding or through offers. You take Marine Le Pen, from Marine Le Pen to Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands to Hungarian Jobbik Party. They've all been wooed by the Kremlin with funding and support and using their troll factory. So to me, it has a lot to do with that, but I can't prove it.
I think it's a really interesting, one of the questions, I see lots of familiar faces from the international history course that Andrew and I have taught together. And one of my favorite types of questions to ask is, at what point could things have been different when we look at, and I think one of the questions will be on a future exam there is, at what point would 2022 have not happened? And I think that there is a narrative there that goes back to whether or not Trump was too soft on Putin. Interestingly, though, about how that plays out in the US domestic politics is this quite strange counter narrative where you'd think that the freedom-loving supporters would want to be pro-Ukrainian freedom, but instead you get this narrative about how the war in Russia is all part of the Great Reset, and it's actually an entirely pro-Russian narrative, which is being picked up by not even people on the far right. Sometimes there's the curious Venn diagram of people who are angry about COVID, people who are libertarians who now see that this is all a giant deep state ploy. So very complicated, and as Frank says, without a lot of direct evidence, but lots of hearsay evidence that a lot of those movements have been orchestrated and supported by Russia anyway.
Yeah, I think it is a terrific question. One thing that I would say is that it's a common mistake to assume that Putin is this strategic mastermind who thinks 5 moves ahead. And I think that mistake is no more evident than in the mind of Vladimir Putin himself, where you would look at the last 2 years, and I think that you're dead on. Like, Putin looks at the world, and there are a couple of things that are worth noting. The first is that he looks at it very much through the lens of a lot of the idioms of the far right that he has himself helped to propagate through his troll factories. He sees as a useful means of undermining the will and unity of the West. But I think he also believes them as well. He was stuck on this idea of the West is decadent, the West is divided, and I'll leave the question of decadence aside, but certainly division, there's no question there's been enormous and asymmetric political polarization within the United States. It's also worth noting, though, that, and I think this is just to kind of throw this into the equation, Trump was famously obsequious to Putin, but US policy towards Russia was not especially favourable under the Trump administration. So, for example, if we look at the way in which the Trump administration approached arms control with the Russian Federation, none of that actually aligned with Russia's interests. The Russians didn't get sanctions relief on the scale that they were expecting under Trump. So he would have looked at it saying, okay, there is a structural antagonism in this relationship to begin with. I do think that he would have looked at it through the lens of the Russians in the last 2 years and thought, this is a decadent and weak West. He would have looked at things like the withdrawal from Afghanistan last year and gone, okay, this is a sign that the West doesn't really have a great deal of resolve. I think it's finally worth noting, though, that it's all politics is local, and it's not just looking at the lack of resolve in the West. We forget this now, but Zelensky actually had some quite significant political problems facing him. Significant political headwinds in 2021. For example, he was coming up against a high court that was resistant to his attempts to address endemic problems of corruption in Ukraine. So I think he would have looked at the landscape and gone, a decadent and divided West, an administration of the Biden that doesn't appear to have a great degree of resolve behind it, and potential short-term opportunities in Ukraine. Yep, good to go.
So, not that it's been challenging for you to also answer various questions already, but I want to give you the floor one last time, starting from Sarah's end, going downwards. 2 minutes sharply in terms of, okay, 75th anniversary of the day of the Russian, not anniversary, I did this for the second time now, 75th 75 days since the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine. What's the next 75 days gonna hold? What are the things that you find we need to most clearly focus on that will be most prominent here?
I'm going to cheat and answer that very quickly and then say something else.
Okay.
So my cheat answer is, and also the answer to your question, is I think the next 75 days are going to look an awful lot like the first 75 days. I think, or not necessarily the first, but certainly where things have been for the last 2 weeks. This is my view. I think we're going to see a war of attrition, and I think it's going to be much of the same. I don't think we're going to see any startling moves from either side. But I would say, coming back, just 2 points to note that are related to the Putin is strategic mastermind thing. One of the things I think is so interesting is that our interest in Russian politics in the West has been so low for a long time. And what Putin has done is shuttled Russia back to the very center of the world stage again, which I think must be very appealing to him, that people were not strategically interested in the former Soviet Union and Russia. If we'd offered a course on Russian politics, none of you would have taken it. And now if we did that, all of you would take it, because we can see the relevance. And I think that writing Russia off as a major military power in our minds has been really dangerous. And that comes to the fact that we don't know a lot about it. So in relation to something that Andrew said, Russia is a colonial state. It's not just the Soviet Union that was a colonial state. It was pre-Soviet Russia that was a colonial state. And if you read about Russia's eastward expansion through the 19th century, it is equally unpleasant and difficult as the West's colonial expansion in the rest of the world. So we are seeing echoes of this coming home to roost that we don't really understand, because most of us don't speak Russian. Most of us haven't studied Russian history. So to really get going, we are still lacking expertise, especially because most of the Sovietologists who were actually quite expert are now retired, and some of them aren't even alive anymore. So we actually don't have the breadth of an analysis that perhaps we should. But I do think that Putin will be very happy with having reinserted himself at absolute center stage for strategic decision-making in the West.
I don't think I have a lot to add other than to say, the war of attrition idea is something I believe in as well. I think that there's not going to be sudden dramatic changes. I think this is now in the stage where it's about sapping the energy out of Ukraine, inflicting a lot of damage and trying to get a victory that way. And it's, and I think there's a bit of a danger of us losing interest in the conflict as well, because it becomes kind of background noise. So my plea to you is keep following it, but also keep digging deeper than just the IR level of blocks and in international. There's a lot to be seen around the intertwinement of the economies, the intertwinement of business, the business world, that makes this conflict even more interesting and even more complex to understand, right? Because of all the things that we read in the Financial Times or in maybe sources that we don't readily look at. I already mentioned the contracts that Western governments have with Russia that they have to oblige to, best not spoken about. There are the financial industries that are heavily intertwined as well. And I think we need to do better than just making claims about countries and militaries, but also look at the political economy and the policy level underneath it.
Thank you. I think, again, the attrition, but I think the attrition is going to continue on both sides. And again, looking at that international law mechanism side, where countries have the capacity to, they will identify novel ways to exert pressure on Russia. Sanctions are continuing. There's a great website called collective.org, which actually outlines all of the different sanctions that are in place and the regular increase to those sanctions, if you're interested. Interestingly, there's only one vessel that is the subject of sanctions at the moment, but over 4,000 individuals, and those numbers are increasing. Australia has taken or instituted legal proceedings along with the Netherlands against Russia for the MH17 crash under ICAO. So that pressure will continue. But then in terms of the actual conflict itself, I think we will continue to see breaches of the laws of armed conflict on the ground. I think we will continue to see the use of novel technologies in ways that have not been tested yet. And so we don't know how they are actually going to comply with the law. But I also think we might see some unfortunate novel uses of existing weapon systems that will likely cause significant humanitarian harm in the way that they are employed. Sorry.
I'm sure I can lift the mood. Not. A grim if useful exercise I find in thinking about conflict is sort of essentially a red team exercise of thinking about, okay, if you're Putin, what are some strategic options that are left available to you? And looking at it through that lens, I think that things can still get significantly worse. Putin knows that there is an extraordinarily low level of patience in the West with regards to bearing the financial burden of this conflict, let alone the post-war burden, which will be considerable. So he has incentives to continue to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure and engage in atrocity crimes. But it gets worse. I talked about the idea of the Russian way of war. A key component of the Russian way of war has been large-scale forced population transfers. If I were Putin, not that I could ever be Putin, I think I'm a nicer person than that. One of the things you'd be thinking about would be, how do I demographically re-engineer the Donbass in a way that will enable me to subsequently have a plebiscite in which the remaining people on the ground seem to endorse a policy of annexation. And we're already seeing large-scale efforts to depopulate Ukraine and forcibly transfer Ukraine speakers into the Russian Federation itself. So it can get worse, and I expect in order to secure a face-saving exit, it will get worse. So I would conclude with two hopes. The first of those is that we don't listen to the so-called wise counsels that are prevailing upon the West to pressure Ukraine to surrender more than the Ukrainian government is willing to surrender. A lot of people at the moment are saying, well, the West should really force Ukraine to bring the conflict to a close by offering a territorial dispensation to the Russian Federation. That would merely embolden Putin and would really give him a better springboard for the next round of aggression that would inevitably occur. The final thing that I'd like to say, though, which twee as it might sound, but I think it's a really important point to note, we should really avoid the peril of conflating the Russian people with the Putin regime. It's very clear in the patriotic victory speeches that this is precisely what Putin wants us to do. There is a risk of genuine and well-founded contempt for what the Russian military is doing, bleeding over into Russophobia. And that's why I've been referring to throughout the presentation the idea of the Russian organizational military culture rather than the Russian people themselves. This is a problem of a highly personalistic dictatorship. There are deeper institutional problems with the Russian military, but this isn't a reflection of the Russian people. And I think that we need to be mindful of that as the atrocity crimes of the conflict likely continue to increase.
Great. So before I ask you to thank our panelists, I just wanted to say this is obviously not that often that we run public events that take place on the same topic twice. We did one in the first 10 days of the invasion. We have now done this on the 75th day of the invasion. Who knows where we might be and do perhaps a third one when we come to, I don't know, 150 or so. But what is really striking is that at least for those of us who study war in the Western way of war, is that these kinds of conflicts have gone, at least in the initial conventional phase, very, very quickly. And now we kind of struggle sometimes like, wow, this is 75 days already, but it's obviously throwing up all sorts of different aspects that speak to our fields, be this in the School of Law and the School of Political Science and International Studies. So very quickly, I would like to thank a few people who are not here or who are here, but without whom this hadn't been possible. First and foremost, Emily, who has been very, very core at setting this up, but unfortunately is stuck behind a wall here on Zoom at home, sick, right? Then also I would like to thank Chloe for jumping in here, holding microphone and doing a great job, but also Liam who did that here as well. I would like, of course, to thank you all for coming in person, but also for Zoom. Hope to see you again soon for similar events. And of course, first and foremost, the four of you here, Sarah, Frank, Lauren, and Andrew.